I had a client a number of years ago who was working on her PhD, and she sat down one morning to start writing her dissertation on her computer and could not remember how to turn her computer on. She literally could not remember how this dang thing worked. Now, obviously, this was an intelligent woman. She was working on her PhD, and thankfully, this was just a temporary issue. It didn't take long before she remembered again, but she was astute enough to realize there was something funky going on here. She used this computer every day, not just for her dissertation, but for other tasks as well. And so it was a real glitch that happened when she just couldn't remember. And so that's why she decided to come see me. She figured there was something going on underneath this symptom. It was strange, and she wanted to figure it out. Now, I love this case because it is such a good example of why I don't use generic hypnosis scripts. Because what would you do if you were working on the symptom here? You might write suggestions like, you easily remember how to turn on your computer. As soon as you sit down, your mind is sharp, clear, and focused, and you remember where the on button is. You find it easy to write. Maybe you'd have her visualize coming to her computer in the morning, turning it on and sitting down and writing. Or maybe you'd set up an anchor so that she had focus and concentration when she sat down and wrote. Now, all of those would be perfectly fine suggestions, I guess, but none of them would help her with what the actual problem was. What I wanted to know was, why was her subconscious stopping her from writing her dissertation? That's an entirely different question. And this is the kind of thing that I teach my hypnotherapy students. When a client comes to see me with a symptom, I don't assume that the symptom is the problem. I get curious about it. Your subconscious runs 90 to 95% of your behavior, and it runs all of the things that you don't do consciously. When you sit down and you can't remember how to turn on your computer, that's not an issue with your conscious mind. That's your subconscious thinking it's helping you out in some way. Because another thing to understand about the subconscious is it is primarily protective. If it thinks that something is going to be harmful to you, that it's going to lead to a negative outcome, it's going to keep you from doing that thing. And so when I worked with this client, we looked at what was going on underneath this symptom. I'm not giving her suggestions for knowing how to turn on her computer. I'm accessing her subconscious, the part of her mind that's responsible for this behavior, and helping her get insight into what this behavior is all about. So, what came up for her in hypnosis was she and her husband were having difficulties in their marriage. And so they had made an agreement that when she was finished with her dissertation, and that was no longer on her plate because it took a lot of time and energy and focus for her, they would have a serious conversation about the future of her marriage. Now we've got a completely different story. On a subconscious level, finishing that dissertation became connected to a conversation she didn't particularly want to have. It became connected to the perhaps end of her relationship. So suddenly we have something we can work with. Her, if finishing this could lead to something painful, an outcome that she doesn't want, then the natural solution is don't finish it. So think about those generic suggestions again. You know how to turn on your computer. Of course you did. You want to finish your dissertation. Of course you did. You feel confident and focused when you write. Fine, but they have absolutely nothing to do with what was actually going on. So this is where a lot of hypnotherapy training falls short. You're given a bunch of scripts. In fact, some hypnotherapy training seduces students with the number of scripts you're going to get. You've got a script for procrastination, you've got a script for confidence, you've got a script for anxiety, you've got scripts for weight loss and smoking and getting better sleep. And when you're new, these scripts can feel incredibly useful. Who doesn't want to have a bunch of ways to deal with all of the different challenges that clients bring in? I thought back in the day, 25 plus years ago, when I started out, that if I just had enough scripts, I'd be able to help anybody with anything. But here's the problem with that. You could have five clients in one day, all coming to see you for procrastination, but they could have completely different things going on underneath their procrastination. One might procrastinate because they learned really early that if they do something well, more might be expected of them. Another might have grown up with somebody critical in their life and they've associated completing something with having it judged. Another might be avoiding the consequences of completing something like this client. They all can say, I procrastinate, but there is something very different for each one of them going on underneath that symptom. And how could you possibly use the same script in all of those different situations? And so when I'm working with a client, I'm looking for clues. I'm looking at their history. I'm looking at the language they use. I'm looking at the associations the subconscious might have going on. I'm listening for messages that they've received. I'm listening for what their subconscious may be trying to protect them from. And I'm asking questions until I have a good understanding of why this behavior, this symptom makes sense. Then I decide what intervention might be useful. I decide what suggestions or what I think of as a hypnotic argument I might present. And so a hypnotic argument isn't simply telling somebody what you want them to believe or what you want them to do. Turn on your computer. It's fine. You know how to turn on your computer. While making a case to the subconscious using the client's own history that's relevant to the situation we're working on to talk them into being able to do something more easily. So, for example, in the case of this woman, she may need to hear you can complete your dissertation and then deal with whatever it is needs to be dealt with in your marriage. No amount of putting off your dissertation is going to benefit your marriage. Her subconscious needs to understand that delaying her dissertation isn't going to help or delay or solve or whatever the problem in her marriage. We have to help the subconscious kind of tease out the connection between the dissertation and her marriage. And so the symptom when the client comes in to me is just a clue. The interesting part is figuring out what that clue is pointing to. And once you start looking at clients that way, hypnotherapy becomes a whole lot more interesting than just finding the right script. If you're learning hypnotherapy, or maybe you're already trained, but you don't feel prepared for the individual sitting in front of you, or you've always been curious about human behavior, this is a lot of what I teach in my whole brain hypnotherapy. I invite anybody who's interested in potentially taking my training to try out the first 2 units for free. There's no obligation to go any further. If that sounds interesting to you, check out the comments. I'll put the link to the test drive there.